People still disagree about what really killed the 1958 Edel citation. But the truth is hidden in places that most people don't look. You might have heard the jokes, you might have seen the pictures, but have you ever stood next to one and felt its weight, its presence, and its strange kind of pride? Because America was on top of the world in the late 1950s. New suburbs were springing up. V8s were the kings of the road, and Detroit thought the future would be made of chrome and bravery. Ford wanted more than just a new model. They wanted a brand new dynasty. And at the height of their confidence, they created the Edel brand, with the Citation as its most important product. Have you ever seen a Citation up close? If you have, you know why this story isn't just about a failure. To figure out why the 1958 Edel Citation ever came out into the open, you need to go back to Ford Motor Company in the early 1950s. A huge empire full of hope and ready to take over every inch of America's booming car market. Chevy and Plymouth were selling cars to young families who were just starting out. Mercury was trying to win over the middle-class people who wanted to be comfortable. Lincoln stood tall at the top of the luxury market. But in the big space between Ford and Mercury, executives saw real money, leaving for Buick and Oldsmobile showrooms. At the time, it seemed like Ford's leaders had no choice but to make that choice. Make a whole new division with its own name, badge, and way of thinking about engineering. The name Edel Ford was meant to connect the brand to something elegant and refined. Inside Dearborn's conference rooms, designers and engineers stayed up late to work on their big ideas, drawing them out in pencil and coffee stains. They thought they were writing the next great chapter in the history of classic American cars. All of that excitement led up to E-Day, September 4th, 1957, when Ford introduced the new mark in a flurry of national ads. You might have seen some of those old ads that say, "The Edsel is the car of the future." The Citation stood at the front of the stage like a polished silver torch when the curtains fell and people leaned in. The first thing people saw was its tall, narrow, vertical grille, which was outlined in shiny chrome. And it was either brave or strange, depending on who you ask. Even now, if you've ever stopped to look at that front end and thought about whether or not you like it, you're not the only one. Detroit never made another face like it. The chrome spears on the sides caught the light like a blade sliding out of a sheath. The tail fins pushed up just enough to nod to the fin wars that were going on highways in the late 1950s, but not too much. The Edsel Citation from 1958 looked long, sure of itself, and very American. There is no doubt that it is rumbling down the boulevard. And inside, there was nothing but ambition. Leather with two colors, thick carpets, and fabrics with metallic threads that shine under the dome lights. The dash had a showy look, as if it was proud of itself. And there, in the middle of the steering wheel, was the Teletouch transmission pad, which had those weird little buttons that promised a more futuristic driving experience. If you've ever wondered what it was like to change gears with just your thumb, the Citation had the answer. The E410 Cubic in V8 had a factory-rated 345 horsepower under that huge hood, and brochures and service sheets from the time back up those numbers. It wasn't a muscle car by definition, but it had enough torque to move the 4,500-pound cruiser with quiet, steady confidence. Ford made it so that it could compete with the Buick Roadmaster and the Chrysler New Yorker. And on paper, the specs put it right in the fight. But even as the ads got better, radio spots, magazine spreads, and showroom banners that stretched across Main Street, things were already going wrong. Ford didn't see them yet, but they were there. A changing economy, a market that is getting colder, and a design that is too bold for its own good. It's interesting how the things that make cars different can sometimes lead to their own demise. And the Citation had a lot of them. Long before most Americans ever got behind the wheel of a 1958 Citation, The first signs of trouble in the Edel dream appeared. By the end of 1957, the U.S. economy was starting to go into a recession, and families who had planned to buy bigger, flashier V8 sedans suddenly had to cut back. Across the country, dealerships felt the slowdown. There were fewer people walking by. It became harder to get financing. Ford launched one of the most expensive mid-range cars Detroit had ever tried to sell, right into that cold wind. The Citation was supposed to be the proud leader of the new Edel division, but it now had a price tag that many buyers couldn't afford. It was in a weird place between segments, too pricey for Ford buyers and not well known enough for Mercury or Buick fans. And if you've ever seen a customer in a showroom hesitate, staring at something they wanted but knew they couldn't afford, you can imagine how Edel dealers felt that fall. Then there were the quality issues that no ad campaign could hide, because Edels were made in more than one factory, some of which were only for them, and some of which were shared. It was hard to keep things the same. One Citation might come off the line perfectly straight. The first door closed with a solid, satisfying click, but the second door's trim didn't line up. Gaskets that leaked or electrical problems that mechanics couldn't figure out. The production teams had to work quickly. Sometimes the engineering instructions were missing parts. Prototype parts accidentally made their way into real customer cars and were the main part of Edsel's innovation. One of its first problems was the Teletouch push-button transmission. The system was mounted in the steering wheel hub and looked like it came from the future, but it was very close to the engine bay, where heat came from. Contacts bent, moisture got in, wires got out of place. Drivers accidentally hit the horn and put the car in neutral, or the buttons didn't work on humid mornings. Teletouch is a great example of how one bad engineering decision can hurt a whole brand. But the problems with the machines were only half of the storm. The other half came from how funny Americans are. Newspapers and magazines made fun of the vertical grille over and over again. It became a national pastime thanks to cartoonists. Some competitors said that Ford had made a car that only an accountant could love. And once a punchline sticks to a product, it's very hard to get rid of it. The name Edel, which was only a few months old, quickly became a word for failure. Dealers cut prices in a panic, marking down Citations so much that the top model sometimes sold for less than mid-range competitors. Customers still hesitated even with the discounts. They weren't just getting a car, they were paying for the uncertainty that came with it. Citations that weren't sold sat on lots from California to Ohio, collecting dust. Ford knew how serious the situation was by the middle of 1958. The Edel project, which was supposed to be a fourth division next to Ford, Mercury, and Lincoln, was falling apart because it was too big. They cut back on the number of models for 1959, made the designs less harsh, and made the engineering easier, but it was too late. The brand's reputation was gone, and there was nothing that could bring it back, not even more chrome or horsepower. The Citation was the worst off because it was the top model and had the highest expectations, so it fell the hardest. Orders stopped coming in, production slowed down, and within a few months the car that was supposed to be Edsel's crown jewel quietly disappeared from brochures. Ford turned off the lights in November 1959. The factories shut down. The signs were taken down. The Edel division was gone after 2 years and almost $500 million spent. A ghost story from Detroit's past. Do you think Ford shut the project down too soon, or was it doomed from the start? The Citations that are still alive today live quieter, more dignified lives. Some are in family garages, wrapped up in thick blankets like old movie stars trying to stay out of the sun. Others sleep in barns where dust settles softly on chrome that still shines when the doors open and light comes in. And then there are the restored examples, which are tall, shiny reminders of what luxury in America was like in the 1950s, before time and technology changed. You know, the car still has a presence that pictures can't capture if you've ever walked up to one at a car show and felt your steps slow down on their own. When you get behind the wheel of the Citation, it feels like you're in a different decade. The steering wheel feels heavy, which is something that modern cars don't have anymore. The suspension floats over the pavement like a boat, with that classic 1950s softness. And the big E400 V8 has a kind of old-school confidence about it. Every pulse of torque rolled through the cabin like the slow beat of a living thing. After a while of driving it, you start to realize that you're not in charge of the car. You're in charge of a moment in American history. People who keep these machines running don't do it to show off. They do it because the Edsel story strikes a chord in a way that success stories never quite do. You can count on success. Failure. A spectacularly ambitious failure leaves questions in its wake. It starts a conversation. It makes people think about what could have happened if the timing, economy, and engineering had all been different. And maybe that's why the Citation is still used today for rare classic cars. It's a machine based on big ideas, even if those ideas didn't work out the way Ford wanted. If you look closely at one today, that vertical grille doesn't look like a mistake anymore. It feels like a signature, something bold, and something that doesn't want to fit in. The thing that critics made fun of is now what brings people to shows and cruise-ins. It's the kind of risk a company that wants to be ahead of the game would take. People may love or hate cars like the Edsel, but they made the world more interesting. If you look up 1950s American luxury, Edsel collectors, or vintage V8 cruisers, you'll see that this car's reputation has changed over the years. What used to mean a mistake now means bravery, which is something Detroit doesn't show very often anymore. The Citation is more than just metal and chrome. It's a reminder of when car companies weren't afraid to take big risks, even if they failed and shook up the whole industry. So, as the dust settles and the garage door closes, I like to think that the Edsel Citation gives us more than just a warning story. It reminds us that people who were willing to take risks built the American road. Crazy, flawed, and great risks. And every time one of these survivors wakes up, it keeps a little bit of that spirit alive. If this story made you think of something that happened to you, like a car your dad drove, a dream you chased, or a classic you missed, please tell us about it below. I'd like to hear the stories that made your road. If you liked this trip back in time to a part of Detroit history that most people don't know about, please like, share, comment, and subscribe for more stories from America's chrome-covered past. See you later.